we picture alchemy, a familiar image often comes to mind. Mysterious figures in hooded robes surrounded by bubbling flasks and eerie green vapors, attempting to turn lead into gold. It's a powerful, almost cartoonish scene, fueled by centuries of folklore and pop culture. But this common picture of a sorcerer seeking forbidden wealth is merely the facade that hides a deeper story. The complete tale of alchemy is a far more complex and fascinating intellectual saga, a testament to human curiosity at its most ambitious. It is a 2,000-year journey of the mind and the hand, a story that begins on the banks of the Nile, flourishes in the Arabic libraries and European monasteries, and ultimately concludes in the modern laboratories that defined the periodic table. Let us trace the path of how this mystical art, this sacred science, quietly and painstakingly transformed into the foundations of modern chemistry. This is not a story of failure, but of evolution, a slow, multi-generational purification of ideas where mystical intuition was gradually transmuted into empirical practice. And welcome to the Chemist's Codex. My name is Peter, and I like to share stories from whatever catches my interest, because I believe those stories can teach us more about ourselves. Alchemy is a truly fascinating topic, and I think there are still a few things modern chemists can learn from the alchemists of old. Alchemy as a practice isn't nearly as mystical or mysterious as you might think. Alchemical writings and symbols just make it seem that way. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Our story begins in a specific time and place. Alexandria, a few centuries into the Common Era. Imagine a city that was the intellectual heart of the world, a crucible of cultures. Here, the meticulous craft traditions of metalsmiths collided with the abstract philosophies of the Greeks. Libraries overflowing with scrolls from across the known world stood near loud, smoky workshops glowing with molten copper and silver. This was the incubator for the art the Greeks called chemia, and the beginnings of alchemy. Two major streams of thought converged here to create alchemy. The first was the intensely practical craft of metallurgy. For centuries, artisans had mastered the art of smelting ores, alloying different metals to create bronze, dyeing textiles, and even creating imitation gemstones. Early papyri that have survived, namely the Leiden and Stockholm papyri, named for the locations the texts are kept, are essentially recipe books for these processes. How to dye wool a certain color, how to make copper look like silver, how to clean pearls. This was a world of tangible transformations, of raw materials being manipulated and changed. The second stream was Greek philosophy, which provided the theoretical framework for these transformations. Thinkers like Aristotle had proposed that all matter in the universe consisted of four elements. We all know the ones: water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Sorry, what were we talking about? Right, alchemy. These elements were not static substances, but were characterized by qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Crucially, they believed in a single underlying prime matter, or prima materia, from which all things were formed. If everything shared a common origin, then it followed that one substance could be transformed into another by altering the balance of its elemental qualities. There's a symbol that exemplifies this idea of prime matter really well. It's a symbol you might already be familiar with, even if you don't know its alchemical relationship. This is the Ouroboros, the image of a snake eating its own tail. In alchemical symbology, the Ouroboros was often drawn with an inscription inside of it, reading "One the All." And that might sound like gibberish or nonsense at first, but it harkens back to the idea of prima materia, that all matter is made of one substance. Early alchemists posed a beautifully simple question. If nature can take one substance and turn it into another, why can't those processes be understood, perfected, and accelerated inside a workshop? They weren't merely chasing gold for its monetary value, they were chasing perfection, viewing metals as living, growing things that could be sick or immature. Lead was not a different substance from gold, but simply an undeveloped version. The alchemist's work was to heal it into its most perfect form. One of the key figures from this era was Zosimos of Panopolis, an alchemist living around the year 300 whose writings offer a window into early alchemical practices. His texts read as part laboratory notebook, part fever dream, blending practical instructions with intense symbolism. He describes how bubbling flasks, furnaces, and complex distillation apparatus were central to the alchemical work of breaking down and recombining matter. Zosimos attributes the creation of many of these apparatus to a figure commonly called Maria Judea, or Mary the Jew. Apparatus for distillation and refluxing, both techniques that are used in nearly any chemistry lab to this day. Finally, this period of early alchemy gives rise to one of its key features that exists in every time period: secrecy and obfuscation. Zosimos really pioneered the use of cover names, or to use the German term, Decknamen. Alchemists would use a different but related name for a common substance. Gold might be referred to as king, or a whole host of things get called mercury and sulfur. This practice was to make sure that only those worthy of the knowledge may possess it, and this practice becomes even more prominent during the Islamic Golden Age. As the Roman Empire fractured, the center of alchemical thought shifted east into the Arabian Peninsula. Alchemy wouldn't be alchemy without Islamic influence. The word alchemy is actually derived from the Arabic language. The chem of the word likely comes from the Greek cheo, meaning to melt or fuse, which is why the practice of melting metals became known as chemia. So when the Arabic language modified the name, it became known as chemia, which the definite article al was placed in front of. Alchemia. But enough etymology, let's get back to alchemy. A pivotal, though somewhat mysterious, figure from this era is Jabir ibn Hayyan. Around the year 800, Jabir's works introduced a new theory. While respecting the classical four elements, and even using the Aristotelian qualities in his own work, Jabir proposed that all metals were composed of two primary principles: a mercury-esque principle, being cold and wet, and a sulfur-esque principle, being hot and dry. Gold was the result of a perfect, balanced fusion of these two principles deep within the earth. Lesser metals were simply imbalanced or impure. Jabir's work introduced a new level of precision and a demand for experimentation. His texts emphasized the importance of repeatable procedures, the careful weighing of ingredients, the timing of reactions, and the documentation of color changes, hallmarks of a budding scientific method. This starts getting into the core of what alchemy actually is. It's not people making stuff up or trying to utilize some form of magic. It's experimentalists working with the best knowledge they had at the time and working to further their own understanding of the natural world. Alongside this emerging empiricism, a short, cryptic text known as the Emerald Tablet became a pillar of alchemical thought. Attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, an amalgamation of various myths and legends. The tablet was said to hold the secrets of the universe in its few poetic lines. In fact, it's short enough that I figure I'll just read it to you. And now, the Chemist's Codex presents a reading of the Emerald Tablet. Truth, certainty, that in which there is no doubt. That which is above is from that which is below, and the which is below is from that which is above, working miracles of one thing. As all things were from one, its father is the sun and its mother the moon. The earth carried it in her belly, and the wind nourished it in her belly, as earth which shall become fire. Feed the earth from that which is subtle, with the greatest power. It ascends from the earth to the heaven and becomes ruler over that which is above and that which is below. The tablet's core axiom, that which is above is from that which is below, provided a powerful philosophical framework. It implied that the transformations observed in the heavens were mirrored on Earth. This being followed by, as all things were from one, also reinforces the concept of a prima materia. The tablet also refers to it, which many alchemists believe to be the Philosopher's Stone, and the described origin of the stone gives a good example of Decknamen. What are the sun and moon referred to? Are they dryness and wetness, or perhaps gold and silver? Of course, it's also important to recognize that the writings of Islamic alchemy became increasingly more secretive from their Greco-Egyptian origins. Jabir writes about how he disperses knowledge, cutting it up and spreading it to many places, in an effort to preserve secrecy. Along with this dispersion was a characteristic initiatic style of alchemical writings. That is to say, the author purposefully writes in a grandiose manner as if they are the master and the readers are initiates. It is said that alchemy arrived in medieval Europe on Friday, February 11th, 1144, when the English monk Robert of Chester finished his translation from Arabic of a book titled On the Composition of Alchemy. Within 100 years, Latin European alchemical texts were being written outright. Here, alchemy evolved into a complex tapestry interwoven with Christian theology. The church's official stance remained suspicious and often hostile. Some viewed transmutation as an attempt to usurp God's creative power, bordering on heresy. Several religious orders explicitly banned their members from practicing the art, largely due to its association with fraud and the vain pursuit of wealth. There are countless anecdotes of a supposed alchemist offering to make gold for someone. They just need money for materials, only to abscond once they receive the payment. Yet, despite this disapproval, the dream of the Philosopher's Stone, that mythical substance capable of transmuting metals, captivated nobles, scholars, and even several friars. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon studied the art as a valid path to understanding God's creation. During this era, alchemical symbolism deepened, becoming intricately intertwined with Christian imagery. The stages of the great work, the magnum opus, were seen as an allegory for spiritual salvation. Base lead, dark and heavy, represented the human soul mired in sin and mortality. Glorious, incorruptible gold symbolized the perfected soul and the resurrected body of Christ. The alchemical crucible was not just a piece of lab equipment, it was a microcosm of the universe, a sacred space where the divine drama of death and rebirth could be reenacted. In fact, crucible comes from the Latin crucibulum, meaning little place of torment, and comes from the same root word as the word crucify. Alchemical texts from this time became illustrated riddles, their secrets deliberately concealed from the unworthy. A green lion devouring the sun was a coded recipe for how aqua regia, a mixture of strong acids, could dissolve gold. A king and queen bathing together, dissolving and re-emerging as a single hermaphroditic being, symbolized the alchemical wedding, the union of the opposing principles of sulfur and mercury to create the perfected Philosopher's Stone. These beautiful and often bizarre images served a dual purpose. They concealed practical chemical instructions for the processes like acid dissolution, distillation, and calcination, but could also be interpreted as profound spiritual guidance for the journey towards enlightenment. The Renaissance, with the advent of the printing press, caused an explosion of knowledge. Ancient hermetic and alchemical texts, once confined to rare manuscripts, were printed and disseminated across Europe, making the craft accessible to a wider audience than ever before, and ushering in alchemy's golden age. In this era of radical change, a transformative and audacious figure named Paracelsus stormed onto the scene. A Swiss physician and alchemist, Paracelsus was a rebel, reportedly publicly burning the traditional medical texts of the time. He audaciously declared that alchemy's true purpose was not the creation of gold, but the creation of medicine. Paracelsus updated alchemical theory, proposing his own tria prima, or three primes: sulfur, mercury, and salt. He believed that all of creation, including the human body, was composed of these three principles, and that illness was simply an imbalance among them. Therefore, diseases could be treated with chemically prepared remedies. He argued that poisons could be medicines if used in the correct dosage, a foundational concept of modern toxicology. Mercury could be used to treat syphilis, and antimony could be a powerful purgative. Laboratories flourished across Europe, functioning as early research departments for wealthy patrons. Emperor Rudolf II hosted a famous court of alchemists and mystics in Prague, turning his castle into a hub of esoteric experimentation. But as the practice grew, so did the tide of skepticism. A new generation of thinkers, armed with a demand for clarity and mechanism, began to question the more mystical elements of alchemy. Robert Boyle, an Irish natural philosopher, sought to demystify alchemical processes and insisted on publishing his results clearly so others could reproduce them. In 1661, he published his landmark work, The Skeptical Chymist. In it, he attacked both the four elements of the Greeks and the three principles of Paracelsus, arguing that they were insufficient explanations for the complexity of matter. He proposed a new definition of an element, a fundamental, perfectly unmingled substance that could not be broken down into anything simpler. And yet, the allure of alchemy persisted, even in the minds of the era's greatest scientific giants. Isaac Newton spent decades of his life deeply immersed in the study of alchemical texts. He wasn't just dabbling. He wrote extensively on the subject, meticulously copying recipes and conducting endless experiments, even producing his own translation of the Emerald Tablet, a testament to the mind that straddled both the old world of alchemy and the new world of physics, seeing them not as separate, but as two parallel paths toward understanding the divine laws of the universe. By the 1700s, alchemy and chemistry, which had previously been used interchangeably, had fully split. Chemistry was being taught in universities, slowly shedding its mystical skin, while retaining the practical laboratory techniques alchemists had been developing for centuries. The final transformation was driven by the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier. Through meticulous and quantitative experiments, Lavoisier established the law of conservation of mass, demonstrating that matter is neither created nor destroyed in a chemical reaction. Lavoisier, along with his colleagues, created a new systematic nomenclature for chemicals, replacing the evocative, symbolic names of alchemy. Chemistry was no longer an art of qualities and principles, it was a science of quantities and measurements. The final blow to the old ways was delivered by John Dalton's atomic theory in the early 19th century. Dalton proposed that all matter was composed of indivisible atoms, and that each element consisted of atoms of a unique and characteristic weight. This provided a simple, powerful explanation for Lavoisier's conservation of mass. It also made the central dream of alchemy, metallic transmutation, appear impossible. Lead and gold were not just different arrangements of the same principles, their fundamental atoms were different. To change one to the other would require changing the atom itself, a feat unthinkable by chemical means. For a time, alchemy was relegated to the scrap heap of scientific history, dismissed as pseudoscience, a foolish and failed precursor to true chemistry. Yet the potent symbolism of alchemy did not vanish. Its language of transformation was adopted by Romantic poets as a rich metaphor for creativity and spiritual renewal. And in the 19th century, a spiritual revival began, led by writers like Mary Ann Atwood, who argued that alchemy had always been a purely spiritual pursuit, a divine science whose chemical language was entirely allegorical. Secret societies and esoteric orders reinterpreted the philosopher's stone not as a physical substance for making gold, but as a symbol of spiritual enlightenment and human perfection. This idea was most famously explored in the 20th century by the psychologist Carl Jung, who saw the stages of the alchemical magnum opus as a profound map of the psychological process of individuation, the journey toward integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the self to become a whole person. But how are people able to interpret alchemical texts and imagery as anything other than a form of science? Well, it's why I kept bringing up secrecy and decknamen and metaphorical images. Alchemical writings have always couched their processes and experiments in secrecy and code names. So when a person living in the modern age looks at alchemical writings, oftentimes out of context, they don't see the practical recipes, they see what looks like a mystic ritual that might as well be magic. And this is something that I think modern chemistry still uses, just in a different form. Decknamen have been replaced with needlessly complex jargon, and many chemistry papers are written with that initiatic style that became popular during the Islamic Golden Age. Authors of modern chemistry research present their work as if they are the master and the readers are initiates of a special order. This isn't just a problem with chemistry either. I've seen several people complain about the reliance on jargon in scientific research, making it incredibly difficult for someone who's not a part of that specific field to read a research paper. It's the modern equivalent of alchemy's secrecy, protecting the work so that only those who are worthy can gain the knowledge. If it wasn't apparent already, this is a problem. When new science is impossible for the layperson to access, it shouldn't be a surprise that distrust in science and conspiracy theories are on the rise. If we want to combat misinformation, we need to make information accessible to everyone. Thus, after 2 millennia of trial and error, of secrecy and revelation, of mysticism and measurement, it becomes clear that alchemy didn't truly fail, it graduated. Its practical, experimental half grew up to become the science of chemistry. Its spiritual, philosophical half was absorbed into systems of mysticism. Yet, in a fascinating final twist, 20th century physics brought the story full circle. Using particle accelerators, scientists have finally achieved the alchemist's dream, successfully transmuting minuscule amounts of lead into gold. The process is fantastically expensive, and the gold created is radioactive, but it proves that on a fundamental level, the alchemists were right about one thing: transmutation is possible. The quest began with Egyptian artisans and Greek philosophers, and has culminated inside the cores of nuclear reactors. A final testament to a tradition that sought to understand the very fabric of reality. Thanks for watching. If this history of alchemy has offered you a new perspective on a practice often misunderstood, then I hope you'll share this exploration with others who might be curious about the hidden roots of modern chemistry. I also want to hear your thoughts on which aspects of alchemy's history you find interesting down in the comments. And if you want more stories that reveal the surprising connections between the past and our present, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming videos.